calling out my sister, a bridesmaid, for insisting she deserves to be maid of honor over me. My older sister Elizabeth, who's 26, just asked me to be her maid of honor for her wedding, which is only a month and a half away. Our 21-year-old half-sister, Brittany, is throwing an absolute fit about it. To give you some background, Elizabeth and I were raised by our mom, just the three of us, for the first 5 or so years of my life. Then Mom met my stepdad, they got married, and soon after, we had our little sister, Brittany. My stepdad is seriously the best. Before he came along, Elizabeth, Mom, and I were crammed into a tiny apartment, barely getting by with secondhand everything. We were happy, though, because we always had a roof over our heads and food on the table. My stepdad has a really good job, so once he and Mom got married and had Brittany, we moved into a huge, beautiful house, basically a mansion compared to our old place, and started getting proper gifts for Christmas and birthdays. This is the life Brittany has always known, while Elizabeth and I definitely benefited from it too. I don't think it affected us quite as much because we still remember what it was like to be careful with money and not have much. My mom is still super thrifty to this day, and we love going thrifting or making our own stuff just like we used to. So Elizabeth and I are pretty different from Brittany in that way. Brittany has always been spoiled, but not in like a throw a tantrum for a new car kind of way, more like she'll ask for a $500 birthday cake and actually get it, or she only wants name brand things, and if she can't have something for whatever reason, she'll sulk for 3 days straight and be super moody. So surprise, surprise, she still lives with Mom and Dad and doesn't even have a job. They seem okay with it, but whatever. Anyway, Elizabeth's boyfriend of 6 years proposed last year, and we were all so excited. He's an amazing guy, and we all adore him. When she first got engaged, she gave me, her friend Madison, and Brittany a box of gorgeous earrings with a note inside that said, "Will you be a bridesmaid?" Mine, however, said maid of honor. We were all so excited and immediately started brainstorming ideas, discussing colors, cakes, and all that fun stuff, but they decided to wait a year to save money and figure out exactly what they wanted. Well, about 4 months ago, Elizabeth announced she was pregnant. As a family, we were overjoyed, except for Brittany, who was strangely quiet and didn't say much about it. Elizabeth then explained that she and Alan decided they wanted to have the wedding in 2 months with about 30 to 40 people, so they could really celebrate before the baby arrived. Stepdad offered them $10,000 so they could have their dream wedding, but given the circumstances, they asked if they could use most of that money toward a house they were looking at instead. And he agreed. So Madison, Elizabeth, Mom, and I have been frantically planning everything, and it's actually been a lot of fun, except for the fact that Brittany hasn't really said anything from the beginning. Whenever we start talking wedding plans, she either zones out on her phone or just completely ignores us. Finally, Elizabeth had to pull her aside and ask her to participate more and give us her input. Brittany agreed, but when we were on our way to the dollar store to pick up some wedding decorations, Brittany scoffed and said, "Dollar store decorations? That's so tacky." But we ignored her and kept doing our thing. Then when we asked if she would help us make handmade invitations, she complained again, saying they'd look like a bunch of preschoolers made them, and just walked away. Finally, just recently, we were all dress shopping, and Elizabeth told us we could pick whatever dress we wanted as long as it was blue because she wanted it to be simple, and we'd be paying for them ourselves. So Mom, Madison, and I went into H&M and found beautiful blue summer maxi dresses in different styles. Mom's had lace details, mine was a floral cotton, and Elizabeth thought they were perfect, except Brittany, of course. She wanted to buy this $2,000 designer bridesmaid gown she found online. My mom told her that was ridiculous, considering Elizabeth's gown didn't even cost that much. So Brittany, of course, started pouting and whining. Eventually Mom caved, and we all went to this fancy bridal shop. Brittany immediately found a blush pink gown that she just had to wear, but it was $1,000. Mom was like, "Absolutely not, plus it's not even blue like the other bridesmaids." My sister then declared that blue was the stupidest color for a bridesmaid dress because we don't even live near the ocean. Ugh, we all left, and she had her little pout session, and Mom lectured her, telling her this is a small, casual backyard barbecue wedding with only 30 to 40 people, and she doesn't need a $2,000 designer dress. Fast forward a few days later, and Brittany announces she found a dress to wear that she already had in her closet, plus it was blue, so we thought, great. But when we went over to Mom and Dad's house, Brittany struts out in her old prom dress from high school, which is basically a puffy ball gown bedazzled with jewels, and as anyone does after high school, she'd grown out of it, so her boobs were practically spilling out, and overall it was just not flattering. On top of all that, she was wearing a tiara full of sparkling jewels that she claimed she bought just for the wedding. Mom and Elizabeth were speechless. Finally, I'd had enough, so I snapped and told her she couldn't possibly be serious. Wearing a dress fancier than the bride is one thing, having your boobs spilling out is another, but wearing a crown on top of that? Who does she think she is? Brittany crossed her arms and said, "I'm the maid of honor, of course I'm going to wear a crown." This is when everyone went silent. until Elizabeth spoke up and said, "Maid of honor? I made Jessica maid of honor, you and Madison are the bridesmaids." Well, that triggered Brittany, she began screeching. "What do you mean I'm not maid of honor? You told me I was when you gave us those presents. I got earrings because I am maid of honor." Now, I don't know if for this past year Brittany really truly thought she was maid of honor and just got the title bridesmaid mixed up, or if she was in denial or simply didn't pay any attention to detail, because I've been maid of honor this entire time, and she hasn't said anything about it until then, but this caused her to have the worst meltdown I think I have ever witnessed in my life. I truly thought people only acted like this in movies or storybooks whenever a Redditor would post about a bridezilla or wedding meltdown. I always thought it must be exaggerated, but this has been the worst meltdown ever in our family. Brittany began screaming and crying. She ripped off her crown and stomped around until Dad came downstairs to see what all the fuss was about. Through her blubbering, she told Elizabeth her wedding was all wrong. She said Elizabeth should be using the $10,000 for a nice wedding instead of that ugly brick house she and Michael wanted, because that's what the money was meant for. She also said it was the stupidest idea ever that my sister would want to get married while pregnant because she'd look like a fat swan in her wedding dress. And again, she rambled on about how blue is a dumb color because we don't live near an ocean. I think at this point she was just pulling stuff out of her ass. Dad tried to calm her down, but she finally screamed that if she can't be maid of honor, then no one can, and she won't go to the wedding. At this point, Elizabeth is a mess and is crying her heart out, and I'm ready to smack that little witch so hard that the crown would stay off her head permanently. But before I can say anything, Elizabeth says, "Fine, you can be maid of honor, you win." And just like that, Brittany stopped crying, and she gave a small smile before going up to her room. Mom and Dad start arguing, Dad saying there's nothing you can do to control a 20-year-old's behavior, and Elizabeth, utterly distraught, had already retreated to another room to call Michael about the possibility of calling off the wedding altogether. I was so furious that I ended up storming into Brittany's room, only to find her on her laptop ordering that ridiculously expensive pink dress. I was so stunned by her audacity that I couldn't even bring myself to confront her. I just turned around and left without saying a word. Downstairs, Elizabeth was sobbing to her fiancé, and my parents were still arguing, while Brittany was happily in her room buying stupid crap because she got her way. I don't think I've ever been this angry in my life. I really wish Elizabeth had more of a backbone. If it were me, I would have told Brittany not to even bother coming if she was going to act like that. I don't even know what to do now. I'm also really hurt that Elizabeth just gave the title to her simply because she threw a tantrum. I have no idea what to say or do to anyone. What am I even supposed to do now? Quick edit. We live on a farm, so we have roughly 6 acres of open space where we're holding the wedding. The cooks who are preparing the hot dogs and hamburgers will be wearing masks. All the guests are required to wear masks. And we have hand sanitizer bottles on every table. Sorry, I completely forgot to mention that earlier. Personally, I wouldn't want to risk it too much, but I'll be wearing a mask and hand sanitizing constantly, so I don't have to miss my sister's wedding. I'm just praying that everything turns out okay. We also have a little outdoor tap that we use as a sink all the time that's available for guests. It slipped my mind that a lot of people probably aren't taking any precautions at all right now, so I wanted to mention that we are, at least a little. Update. Okay, so I wanted to give you all an update on what happened this afternoon. Not to shame my sister for demanding to be maid of honor instead of me, but just to fill you in, when I initially made that post, it was already 3 days after Brittany's meltdown. So I had a lot of time to think about everything and soak in everyone's advice. Michael, Elizabeth's fiancé, actually called me early this morning and asked if I could come over to see Elizabeth, because he's completely fed up with Brittany, and we needed to act fast. I was relieved to hear that I wasn't the only one who was sick of it besides you guys on Reddit. So, I went over straight away. Elizabeth was on the couch in her pajamas, hair unwashed, and it looked like she had been crying for the last few days. Seeing her like that absolutely broke my heart. And she immediately apologized to me and said she didn't know what to do anymore. Michael said he thought the 3 of us should sit down with her and have an intervention, but Elizabeth shut that down immediately, saying she couldn't handle any more yelling. I agreed that being yelled at is the last thing Elizabeth needs, and that it should just be me and Michael. But Elizabeth was nervous about that too. She didn't want Brittany to feel like she was being ganged up on. So, finally, after some back and forth, Elizabeth decided that she just wanted me alone to talk to Brittany, without Mom and Dad or Michael there. She and I together made a list of things that I needed to address with her, so that things wouldn't steer off topic. such as how it's completely unacceptable to yell at a pregnant woman, no matter the circumstances, how disrespectful she was to criticize anything with the wedding and the name-calling. And of course, the most important part about her crying in order to be made maid of honor. I also decided to bring up the fact with Elizabeth that Madison and I, the other bridesmaid, were planning to have a fun bachelorette slumber party in a few days to help Elizabeth celebrate. Elizabeth's face lit up, and she seemed genuinely excited. I told her it was supposed to be a surprise, and Brittany was supposed to come. But given the circumstances and the fact that it's at my apartment, I didn't want her there anymore. And I wanted to see if Elizabeth was okay with that. She said she was, and that she'd much rather have her other friend over instead in place of her. I told her that was completely fine. And after some more talking, I made my way over to Mom and Dad's to see Brittany. As soon as I walked in, Mom asked me what I was doing there. And I told her I needed to speak to Brittany. Mom looked around and in a hushed tone, told me it was best if I left because for the last 3 days after things were resolved, Brittany has been perfectly happy and no one in this family needs any more drama. I told Mom I was sorry, but things in fact were not resolved. They were far from resolved. That's when Brittany walked into the kitchen and asked what I was doing there. Mom tried to brush it off and said, "Nothing, Jessica was just coming to get something, but she's on her way out now." But I told her, "No, actually, that's a lie. I'm here to talk to you about what happened the other day alone." Brittany didn't seem pleased, and Mom's face was as red as a tomato, but Brittany and I proceeded to go into her bedroom to talk. I firstly told her how completely unacceptable it was for her to raise her voice and scream at a pregnant woman because of how harmful it was for the baby. Immediately, Brittany scoffed and said, "No, it isn't. Don't make up lies to make me feel guilty." I asked her what lies, and she said, "The baby isn't going to be affected just because I raised my voice. It doesn't even know what's going on. You're just making stuff up." What am I supposed to do with this girl, I swear? I decided it was no use arguing with stupid, so I told her that pregnant or not, this was Elizabeth's wedding, not hers, and all of the name-calling she did and harsh criticism of the decorations was completely childish and unacceptable. I then brought up the fact how her throwing that tantrum to get her way was the most childish thing I've ever seen in my life, and that if things were reversed, and I made Elizabeth take away Brittany's maid of honor job, she would have lost her mind, so how is it in any way alright for her to do it to me? In response to that, she told me I'm acting so pathetic and that I reek of jealousy. She then said, "There's no real problem here, you're just jealous. Elizabeth decided she wanted me after all." I told her this was false. Elizabeth wanted me, otherwise she wouldn't have asked, but agreed to make Brittany maid of honor to stop the fighting. Brittany, with a really smug look on her face, said there was absolutely nothing I could do about it now, so I'd better just get over it. That's when I told her she was no longer invited to the sleepover we had planned, and that Elizabeth also didn't want her to come until Brittany decided to apologize to me, Elizabeth, and our parents for her outrageous behavior. She was also no longer welcome in my and my fiancé's home. Suddenly, Mom burst through the door. I'm guessing she was eavesdropping, and went completely ballistic. She told me I had no right to ban Brittany from the sleepover and from my house, and that the only reason I was doing it was to get back at her. She said I was stirring up unnecessary drama, and that at least Brittany didn't mean to hurt anyone's feelings the other day, whereas right now I was doing it on purpose. This is when Brittany starts to cry and moan about how I'm always bullying her and I'm not being fair. My mom then goes over to Brittany, starts rubbing her back and says, "I know, honey, she's being very rude to you right now. You didn't start anything. Gag me with a spoon." That's when I noticed stepdad standing at the door, and I said to him, "Do you not see all this? Did she at least tell you she bought that pink $2,000 dress?" Dad looked awkwardly between my mom's sister and me before saying, "I think everyone is stressed out and no one means what they say. Sisters fight, and I know by the end of the wedding you'll all be the best of friends again." At this point, I really had enough. I told everyone I was leaving, and Mom got up and said the discussion wasn't over. I told her, "Actually, it is over, and unless Brittany apologizes to me and Elizabeth, I will not be speaking to her." On my way out, I heard Brittany say there was nothing she needed to apologize about, but I kept walking. To say that I was hurt and angry would be an understatement. With how my head was pounding, I just wanted some Advil and juice, so I went to the nearest convenience store. Now, this part might have been where I crossed the line. I'm honestly not sure. In my last post, I didn't mention it because I didn't find it relevant, but Brittany has a boyfriend. She's been going out with him for approximately 6 months. His name is Tyler. He's 27. He's hardcore Christian, and overall a really cool guy. I've actually met him at the city's university about 2 years ago, and we had a lot of the same courses together and became friends. He and Brittany have quite a bit in common. They both love animals. He fosters animals all the time. And Brittany, at that point was debating on studying to be a vet, so at the beginning of January Tyler moved back to our part of the city, where he got a job as a pharmacist, and that's when he and Brittany started going out, which we were all cool with because he really is a great person because of his Christian values. He's very excited to get married and have kids ASAP. He said multiple times he hopes to be engaged by the end of this year. Brittany is also his first relationship, which might be another reason why he's so anxious for the commitment. Anyway, I got some Advil and juice and was surprised to see Tyler, because I didn't know he worked at this particular pharmacy, so he waved me over and saw the Advil and asked if I was sick. I told him no, just a headache from the wedding stress. He said, "Oh, Brittany never mentioned any wedding stress. She said things were going great." This surprised me but mostly pissed me off, so I asked him if that meant she never told him about the situation a few days before. He had no clue, so I made it brief and I told him the highlights of her name-calling, screaming, choosing her own dress against my sister's wishes, and how now she's the new maid of honor. This surprised Tyler and he said stuff like, "Are you sure?" "I know Brittany, she always hates yelling. She didn't actually make that big of a scene, did she?" I told him yes, it was all very unfortunately true. Then I told him that if she talks to him, to please recommend her some sort of therapist. He knows quite a few, and I told him perhaps she might even need medicine for bipolar disorder. For all I know, I told him I am now out of her life unless she apologizes, and if I were him, I would think very carefully before making a commitment to her anytime soon. He stood there and didn't respond, so I left. And when I went home, Alan and my fiancé were playing video games and they asked what happened, so I told them everything. Alan and my fiancé think I was in the right for everything, including warning Tyler. Later on that evening, however, I got countless texts from Brittany and my mother, who were furious that I mentioned anything to Tyler just to start drama on purpose. I did not respond to any of the messages and instead, I blocked both of their numbers for the time being. As for Tyler, Brittany has him wrapped around her little finger completely, so I honestly don't see him doing anything drastic. He sees how she is when she's pouty, and how she is when she's spoiled, but I think all of that goes over his head completely. But still, I felt I needed to say something. I wish I could say I feel better and like a new woman, but I don't. I feel hurt and betrayed. It feels like my throat or my chest are clogged, and I honestly don't know if it'll ever clear. At the end of the day, Elizabeth called me and said she really wants me as her maid of honor, but in order to keep the peace, she is choosing Brittany for now. I will swallow my pride and my pain and support my favorite sister in anything she decides, and I'm going to love my new niece/nephew to bits. Thank you everyone for listening, and if you have any more advice or words of wisdom, I'm all ears. Update. So, it's been about 2 weeks I think. It's all been a weird blur since I had that talk with Brittany. I had since then blocked my mom, dad, and Brittany on everything, just hoping things might settle down on their own. Well, it didn't exactly settle, but here's what happened. About 2 weeks after everything, my fiancé and I were just chilling late one evening around 2:00 am. While my fiancé and I were just relaxing and watching TV, he got a phone call from Brittany. He'd never blocked her number or mom, so initially we just ignored it, not wanting to deal with whatever Brittany wanted to talk about at that hour. But then, right after we ignored the first call, she called a second time and left a voice message telling my fiancé to pick up the phone ASAP because there was an emergency. Immediately, he called back, and all we could understand from Brittany was that something was going on with mom, and she didn't know what to do. We hurried over there and were greeted by Brittany, who told us mom was acting hysterical and she didn't know what to do. When I asked where stepdad was, she said they had gotten into a huge argument a few days prior, and he was now staying at a hotel somewhere. She led us to mom's room, and on the way there, I could see that the family photos hung up in the hallway were either lying on the floor or smashed. When we entered the bedroom, however, mom was calmly watching a TV show. She looked over at me and said something along the lines of, "Well, if it isn't my only daughter." Her speech was incredibly slurred, so it was hard to hear. And Brittany told me not to pay any mind to what she was saying because for the last hour she'd been out of it and saying random things. I thought maybe mom was going to start shouting or something, but instead she continued to watch TV. I asked Brittany if mom was drunk and she said she wasn't sure. Although she knew she had some wine earlier, apparently mom had been saying weird stuff that just made no sense at all, then started screaming and shouting about broken families being stuck in the picture frame, so that's why there was that mess in the hall. As I was questioning Brittany, my fiancé decided to call the emergency line to get mom an ambulance. He asked Brittany if mom was on any medication, and apparently she was on something for anxiety and depression, which I had no idea about. I knew mom had anxiety issues, but I never knew much else. Once fiancé got off the phone with the emergency line, Brittany went and grabbed us the bottles of mom's medications to bring to the doctors. While fiancé tried to get a hold of my stepdad, I asked Brittany if she contacted our other sister, and she said no because she didn't want to cause any unnecessary stress for her or for the baby. She then went on to admit that she knew I was right the entire time when I told her that stress could affect a pregnancy, but she just didn't want to admit it before. I decided now wasn't the time to argue and just kept my mouth shut. Eventually, the paramedics came, and just as they did, Mom started screaming in hysterics again, screaming and yelling stuff that I don't even quite remember because it was garbled and didn't make sense. Something about her needing to stay to feed the baby. We all went to the hospital, and eventually fiancé finally got a hold of stepdad and he arrived much later. But the doctor figured with the amount of stress with her and dad's constant fighting, plus with the mixture of alcohol and her medication, turns out she had drank quite a bit that night. It was like she just sort of snapped and she became somewhat confused and disoriented. He also figures Mom hasn't been taking her medication properly. Physically, Mom was perfectly fine, but they are keeping her in for a few days just to keep an eye on her due to COVID. I haven't been able to visit her or see her until she gets released, but Dad was able to go in and verify a few things as far as I know. He's not really allowed to stay with her either, and was only able to see her that night she was admitted. As for the actual wedding stuff, while Brittany and I were driving back home, she had told me that Elizabeth texted her a few days before and told her that I was still going to be maid of honor, that the decision was final, and she would not be answering her or our parents' phone calls or texts about the matter. Hearing this had led to more fighting between Mom, Dad, and Brittany and shouting, and that's when things went mostly downhill. Neither Brittany nor my parents have spoken to Elizabeth in a few days since. I was completely taken aback, especially since Elizabeth never told me this herself. I tried getting more information, but Brittany was pretty much silent the entire way back home. She did have a little speech prepared about how she might no longer ever consider me her sister again, how betrayed she was by everything, and I just let her talk and didn't have much to say. I was too tired to fight or do anything, and she had nothing else to say about the wedding or Mom's breakdown, and I haven't spoken to her since. Currently, I am looking for family therapy for the very near future. I'm not sure what's available since COVID, but I plan on getting in touch with Mom's doctor to see if he has any suggestions. I had told Alan what had happened, and I'm hoping he will be able to tell Elizabeth without her stressing out too much. I suggested he keep it vague, and to tell her Mom was completely fine. This all started because of wedding plans, but I guess we just had our problems from the start, and it all escalated. Feel free to ask any questions, and I'll do my best to answer. It's all been a bit foggy for me, so I may have left out important details. Final update: Elizabeth had the wedding. It was before the second lockdown and out on our family's farm with maybe 50 people that showed up. Brittany wore the dress she chose because Elizabeth caved, and then wore the tiara thing she picked out. Days before the wedding, Brittany made Facebook posts directed at me. Just statuses saying stuff like, "Can't believe my own family would be so toxic and bully me." Stuff like that. So eventually I blocked her. Honestly, nothing too out there happened during the wedding. Brittany got drunk and tried to sing and dance and make the attention fall on her, of course, but nothing overly outrageous. She gave me the cold shoulder big time, and if I would enter the room, she would announce that she can't be around negative energy, then leave, dragging her boyfriend with her. Her boyfriend proposed to her and texted me asking if I would please try to make things up with her and help plan the wedding. I told him I was sorry, but I still wanted to be his friend. I just can't have her in my life. He told me he was sorry, and he hopes we one day reconcile. Haven't spoken to Brittany in months, but Elizabeth is doing good, and they still keep in touch. Mom and my stepdad have been silent, and I've just been keeping my distance as well. I don't have any of them on Facebook anymore, but Elizabeth keeps me in the loop anyway. Not much else has happened. Not a very exciting update, but thanks everyone for the support.